It was early in the morning in the small village of Kano. The sun had barely risen above the hills when a young man named Daniel stepped out of his small one-room house. His clothes were simple and worn. His shoes had seen better days. But his face carried something that poverty could never take away, a quiet dignity that made people look at him twice. Daniel was 26 years old. He had grown up in this village without a father and without much. His mother had passed away 2 years before, leaving him completely alone in the world. Since then, he had been doing odd jobs around the village just to survive. Some days he carried heavy loads at the market. Other days he helped farmers clear their land. Whatever work came his way, he took it without complaining. That morning, he was heading to the river to fetch water before starting his day. He carried 2 large empty containers in his hands. The road to the river passed through a narrow path surrounded by tall trees and thick bush. Birds were singing softly above him as he walked. The air was cool and the village was still quiet. He had not gone far when something stopped him. An old woman was standing alone by the side of the road. She was very old, her back slightly bent, her white hair wrapped loosely in a faded cloth. She held a walking stick in one hand and a large clay pot in the other. The pot was clearly too heavy for her. She was struggling, trying to balance it on her head, but her hands were shaking. Every time she lifted it, her knees trembled beneath her. Daniel stopped walking. He watched her for a moment. Around him, a few other villagers passed by on the same road. Some glanced at the old woman and looked away. Others simply walked faster, pretending not to notice. Nobody stopped. Daniel set his containers down quietly and walked toward her. "Mama, please let me help you," he said gently. The old woman turned slowly and looked at him. Her eyes were tired but sharp. She studied his face carefully, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "I am fine, my son," she said. "Do not trouble yourself." Daniel smiled softly. "You're not fine, Mama. That pot is too heavy for you. Please, let me carry it." She hesitated for a moment. Then slowly she released the pot into his hands. It was heavier than he expected. He placed it carefully on his own head and steadied it with one hand. Then he looked at her. "Where are you going, Mama?" She pointed down the path. "My house is not far. Just follow this road and turn left after the big mango tree." They walked together slowly, matching her pace. Daniel did not rush her. He did not make her feel like a burden. He simply walked beside her, quietly, the way a son walks beside his mother. When they arrived at her compound, Daniel placed the pot down carefully near her door. The compound was small and simple. An old wooden bench sat outside. A few dry leaves covered the ground. Everything about the place spoke of a woman living alone with very little. He looked around for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Mama, do you live here alone?" The old woman sat down slowly on the bench. She let out a quiet breath before answering. "Yes, my son. I live alone." Those 3 words landed heavily in Daniel's chest. He thought of his own mother. He thought of how she had grown old in a small house just like this one. He thought of how much it meant when someone simply showed up. He did not leave immediately. Instead, he asked if there was anything else she needed. She shook her head, but her eyes said something different. He picked up his empty containers and turned to go. "I will come back to check on you, Mama," he said. She looked at him with something between surprise and gratitude. "What is your name, my son?" "Daniel," he replied simply. She nodded slowly, as if the name meant something to her already. "My name is Margaret," she said. He smiled once more, then turned and walked back down the path toward the river. He did not know it yet. But that small moment, that single act of kindness on an ordinary morning, was about to change the entire direction of his life. From that day, Daniel kept his word. Every evening after finishing his work around the village, he would walk to Margaret's compound. Sometimes he came with firewood. Other times he fetched water for her before she could even think of going to the river herself. On days when he managed to earn a little extra from the market, he would stop at a small roadside shop and buy her something simple. A little salt. Some cooking oil. A small bunch of vegetables. Margaret never asked for any of it. But she never turned it away either. At first, she watched him carefully. She was an old woman who had seen enough of life to know that people rarely did things without expecting something in return. But as the days passed and Daniel kept coming back with nothing to gain, something in her slowly began to change. The walls she had built around herself began to come down, one quiet evening at a time. They would sit together outside her compound after he finished whatever needed to be done. She would tell him stories about the village from many years ago, about how the river used to be wider, about how the big market used to run 3 days a week instead of one, about how her late husband used to wake up before sunrise every single morning without fail. Daniel listened to every word. He never looked at his watch. He never gave her the feeling that he had somewhere more important to be. One evening, Margaret looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel," she said quietly, "you are a good young man. But I have been watching you. You struggle every day just to eat. You do all this hard work and still you find time to come here and help an old woman." She paused. But Daniel looked down at the ground for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "Because nobody helped my mother when she needed it," he said honestly. "I do not want another old woman to feel that nobody sees her." Margaret said nothing for a long time after that. But her eyes became soft in a way Daniel had never seen before. What she did not tell him that evening was that she had already been telling people about him. The village women at the market had heard his name from her lips more than once. The old men who sat under the tree near the church had heard her speak of the young man who came every evening without fail. Word was moving quietly through the village like water through dry ground. But none of that reached Daniel. He simply kept coming. One afternoon, everything changed. A large black SUV drove slowly into the village. Vehicles like that were rare in Kano. People stopped and stared as it moved through the dusty road. Children ran alongside it. Old men shielded their eyes from the sun to get a better look. The vehicle stopped in front of Margaret's compound. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out. He looked to be in his early 50s. His clothes were clean and expensive. His shoes were polished. He looked around the village with calm, observant eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen the world far beyond these dusty roads. His name was Richard, and Margaret was his mother. He had not visited in over a year. Business had kept him away longer than he intended, but something his mother said during their last phone call had stayed with him. She had mentioned a young man. A poor young man who came every evening and asked for nothing. Richard had not forgotten that. He entered the compound and found his mother sitting on her old bench. She stood up the moment she saw him. They embraced quietly the way people do when words are not enough. After they sat down together, Richard looked at her carefully. "Mama," he said, "tell me more about this boy, Daniel." Margaret smiled slowly. "You will meet him this evening," she said simply. "He always comes." Richard leaned back and folded his hands. His eyes moved to the gate of the compound. He was already curious. But what he would see when Daniel arrived that evening was something he had not prepared himself for at all. Richard did not have to wait long. Just as the sun began to lower itself behind the trees and the evening air turned cool, the sound of footsteps came from outside the compound. Then the gate opened slowly and Daniel walked in. He was carrying firewood under one arm and a small bag of groceries in the other. His clothes were dusty from a full day of work. His face carried the tiredness of someone who had been on his feet since before sunrise. He stepped inside and looked toward the bench where Margaret usually sat. Then he stopped. There was a man sitting beside her. A man in expensive clothes. A man who looked completely out of place in this small compound. Daniel hesitated for just a moment. Then he greeted respectfully. "Good evening, Mama." "Good evening, sir." Margaret smiled warmly. "Come, my son. Set those things down." Daniel placed the firewood carefully by the side of the house and set the small grocery bag near the door. Then he came and stood before them quietly. Richard studied him from head to toe without saying a word. He saw the worn clothes. He saw the dusty shoes. He saw the tiredness in the young man's face. But he also saw something else. Something that could not be bought or borrowed. There was a gentleness in Daniel's eyes and a straightness in his posture that told Richard everything about the kind of person he was before a single word was exchanged. Margaret looked at Daniel with pride. "This is my son Richard," she said. "He came from the city this afternoon." Daniel nodded respectfully. "It is good to meet you, sir. Your mother speaks about you often." Richard finally spoke. "And she speaks about you even more." There was a short silence. Then Richard continued. "Sit down," he said calmly. "I want to talk to you." Daniel sat down on a small stool across from them. He was not nervous. He simply sat the way he always did. Quietly. Waiting. Richard leaned forward slightly. "My mother tells me you come here every evening. That you fetch water for her. Bring her food. Help around the compound." He paused. "She says you have been doing this for weeks without asking for anything." Daniel looked at Margaret briefly, then back at Richard. "She needed help," he said simply. "That is all." Richard was quiet for a moment. Something about that answer settled in his chest in a way he did not expect. He had met many people in his years of business. People who smiled too wide and talked too much. People who performed kindness like a transaction, always keeping one eye on what they would receive. Daniel was different in a way that was immediately clear. There was no performance here. No calculation. Just a young man who had come with firewood and groceries after a full day of hard work because an old woman needed help. Richard cleared his throat. "What do you do for work?" he asked. Daniel answered honestly. "Whatever I find. Market work. Farm clearing. Carrying loads. Anything available." Richard nodded slowly. "Did you go to school?" Daniel looked down briefly. "I finished secondary school," he said. "I wanted to continue, but there was no money after my mother passed." Richard said nothing immediately. He simply looked at him for a long moment. That evening the three of them sat together until the sky turned dark. Margaret cooked a simple meal and they ate together. Richard watched how Daniel helped without being asked. How he carried the pot from the fire without being told. How he washed the plates afterward while Margaret rested. How he did all of it naturally without making it seem like a favor. When it was time to leave, Daniel said goodnight to both of them and walked out through the gate the same way he always did. No expectations. No hints. Just a quiet goodbye. Richard sat with his mother in the dark compound after Daniel left. He turned to her slowly. "Mama," he said, "how long has he been coming here like this?" Margaret looked toward the gate where Daniel had disappeared. "Since the first morning he saw me struggling at the roadside," she said. "He has not missed a single evening." Richard stayed silent for a long time after that. Inside his chest, a decision was forming. Slowly at first. Then with increasing certainty. He picked up his phone and made a call. The person on the other end answered immediately. "I need you to find out everything about a young man," Richard said quietly. "His name is Daniel. He lives here in Kano Village." He paused and looked toward the dark path where Daniel had walked. "I think I have found someone very rare," he said. 3 days passed after that evening. Richard stayed in the village longer than he had originally planned. He told his mother it was because he wanted to rest. But the truth was different. He was watching. Every evening Daniel came. Every evening he worked quietly without being asked. Every evening he sat with Margaret and listened to her stories with the same patience and the same warmth. Richard had seen enough. On the 4th morning he called Daniel to the compound early. Daniel arrived just after sunrise, slightly surprised to be summoned at that hour. He greeted Margaret inside the house and then came and sat across from Richard in the compound. Richard did not waste time. "Daniel," he said calmly, "I want to offer you something." Daniel looked at him quietly and waited. Richard continued. "I run a construction and real estate company in Lagos. It is a large company. We build hotels, office buildings, shopping complexes across the country." He paused briefly. "I have been looking for someone to train as a site supervisor. Someone I can trust completely. Someone with character." Daniel said nothing. He simply listened. Richard looked at him directly. "I want that person to be you." The compound went silent. Even the birds seemed to stop for a moment. Daniel stared at Richard. Then he looked at Margaret, who was sitting by the door watching them with quiet satisfaction on her face. Then he looked back at Richard. "Sir," he said slowly, "I have no experience in construction. I have no university degree. I am just a village boy who does odd jobs." Richard nodded. "I know all of that," he said. "I am not looking for a certificate. I am looking for character. Certificates I can find anywhere. What you have is something I cannot teach a man in any classroom." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then Richard added, "I will train you fully. You will start from the bottom and learn everything. I will cover your accommodation in Lagos and pay you a proper salary while you train. After 1 year, if you prove yourself, you will be given full responsibility over one of our active project sites. Daniel lowered his eyes. His hands tightened slightly on his knees. He thought about his mother, about how she had worked her whole life in this same village and died with nothing, about how he had spent 2 years carrying loads and clearing farms just to eat 1 meal a day, about how many mornings he had woken up with no work and no money and nothing waiting for him except another hard day. He thought about all of it in those few seconds of silence. Then he looked up at Richard. "I will not disappoint you, sir," he said quietly. Richard extended his hand. Daniel shook it firmly. Margaret made a soft sound from the doorway. When both men turned to look at her, her eyes were wet. She was not crying loudly. She was simply sitting there with tears moving slowly down her old face and a smile that carried years of prayer finally answered. 2 days later, Richard prepared to return to Lagos. His driver loaded the SUV early in the morning. Before leaving, Richard gave Daniel a date to arrive in Lagos and an address to report to. He also handed him an envelope. "For travel and whatever you need before you arrive," Richard said simply. Daniel accepted it with both hands and bowed his head slightly. As the SUV drove slowly out of the village, people stopped and watched the way they had watched it arrive. But this time, Daniel was not standing in the crowd watching with everyone else. He was standing at the gate of Margaret's compound. And Margaret was beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. That afternoon, word spread through the village quickly the way it always did in small places. People said Richard had come from the city and taken a special interest in the poor boy who helped old Margaret. Nobody could fully explain it. Some were surprised. Some were confused. A few were quietly jealous. But one old man who sat every afternoon under the tree near the church simply nodded when he heard the news. He said nothing for a moment. Then he spoke. "That boy always had something different about him," the old man said. "You cannot help people the way he helped that woman and receive nothing in return. It does not work that way." Nobody argued with him. Because deep in their hearts, every single person in that village already knew he was right. Lagos was nothing like Kano village. The moment Daniel stepped off the bus, the city hit him like a wave. Noise everywhere. Cars moving in every direction. People rushing past each other without looking up. Buildings taller than anything he had ever seen rising above him on both sides of the road. The air smelled of fuel and food and something he could not name. He stood at the bus station for a moment with his small bag hanging from his shoulder and the address Richard had given him folded carefully in his pocket. He had never felt so small in his life. But he did not allow that feeling to stay long. He took a breath, asked for directions from a man nearby, and started walking. He found the address after almost an hour of navigating through unfamiliar streets. It was a large compound with a tall gate. A security guard checked his name against a list and let him through without much conversation. Inside, he was shown to a small but clean room in a staff quarters at the back of the property. The room had a proper bed, a ceiling fan, a small table, and a bathroom. To Daniel, it felt like more than enough. He set his bag down and sat on the edge of the bed quietly. He had made it. The next morning, he reported to the company office early. Richard was not there that day but had left clear instructions. Daniel was introduced to the operations manager, a serious middle-aged man named Mr. Haruna, who looked him over with little expression and handed him a yellow safety helmet and a pair of work boots. "You start on site today," Mr. Haruna said. "But listen. Ask questions when you do not understand. Do not pretend to know what you do not know." Daniel nodded. "Understood, sir." The site was a large hotel under construction on the outskirts of the city. Hundreds of workers moved around it at any given time. Concrete mixers turned steadily. Steel rods rose from the ground in neat rows. Engineers walked around with rolled drawings under their arms. Supervisors shouted instructions across the noise. Daniel said nothing on that first day. He simply watched everything with focused eyes. He arrived before anyone told him to and left after most others had gone. When a worker dropped something heavy nearby, he helped pick it up without being asked. When a junior worker looked confused about where to carry materials, Daniel walked with him and helped figure it out quietly. Mr. Haruna noticed. He said nothing that first week. But he noticed. Weeks passed. Daniel learned faster than anyone had expected. Not because he was loud or tried to impress anyone, but because he paid attention to everything. He remembered what he was shown the first time. He asked intelligent questions. He never made the same mistake twice. But not everyone was happy about his progress. There was a man on site named Victor. Victor had been working at the company for 3 years. He was loud, confident, and used to being the most noticed junior staff member on any project. When Daniel arrived, Victor had looked him over once and dismissed him completely. Just another village boy, Victor had said to a colleague that first week. He will not last a month. But as the weeks turned into months and Daniel continued to grow, Victor's dismissal slowly turned into something darker. He began making small comments under his breath when Daniel passed. He gave wrong instructions to workers and then quietly told Mr. Haruna that Daniel had made errors. He moved Daniel's tools and hid his work reports. Small things. Calculated things. Daniel noticed all of it. But he did not react. He did not confront Victor. He did not complain to Mr. Haruna. He simply worked harder and documented everything he did carefully in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket every single day. One evening after the site closed, Daniel sat alone in his room and called Margaret. Her voice came through the phone warm and familiar like something from another world entirely. "How are you, my son?" she said. "I am well, Mama," he replied. "Learning every day." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Remember why you are there. Stay humble. Stay honest. Let your work speak for you." He closed his eyes briefly when she said that. "I will, Mama," he said. "I promise." After the call ended, he sat in the quiet room for a long time. Outside, the city moved and roared without stopping. But inside that small room, Daniel felt completely steady. He opened his notebook and continued writing. 3 months after Daniel arrived in Lagos, something happened that nobody on site expected. A serious problem was discovered at the hotel construction project. A section of the building on the 3rd floor had developed a structural fault. The concrete columns in one corner were showing early signs of cracking. If left unaddressed, the entire section would be at risk of collapse during finishing stages. It was the kind of problem that could cost the company millions and destroy its reputation completely. Mr. Haruna called an emergency meeting on site. Engineers gathered around the blueprints. Senior staff argued back and forth about the cause. Some blamed the concrete mixture. Others blamed the timeline pressure. Nobody had a clear solution that everyone agreed on. Daniel stood at the back of the group and said nothing. But his notebook was open in his hands. For the past 6 weeks, he had been quietly recording something that nobody else had noticed. Every morning when he arrived on site before the others, he had observed that the water being mixed into the concrete in that specific section was being measured incorrectly. The worker responsible was rushing the process to meet daily targets. The mixture was consistently too weak. Daniel had written it down every single day with dates and measurements because something had felt wrong to him, and he had learned from his mother never to ignore a feeling that something was wrong. He had not reported it earlier because he was the most junior person on the entire project, and he was not yet sure enough of himself to speak against experienced engineers. But standing in that meeting watching everyone argue without answers, he made a decision. He stepped forward quietly. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Mr. Haruna. The room turned and looked at him. Some faces showed irritation at the interruption. Victor, who was standing nearby, let out a short laugh under his breath. Mr. Haruna looked at him. Daniel opened his notebook and began explaining calmly. He showed his daily records. He pointed to the dates. He explained the measurements he had observed and compared them to the correct specifications on the blueprint. He spoke clearly and without rushing. He did not accuse anyone. He simply presented what he had written down every morning for 6 weeks. The room went completely silent. One of the senior engineers took the notebook and studied it carefully. Then he looked at the blueprint. Then he looked at the section in question. His face changed slowly. He turned to Mr. Haruna. "The boy is right," he said quietly. Everything shifted in that moment. The problem was traced, confirmed, and a solution was designed within 2 days. The section was reinforced properly before any further damage could occur. The project was saved. The company avoided what would have been a catastrophic and expensive failure. Mr. Haruna called Daniel into his office the following morning. He sat across from him and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "How long have you been recording that?" he asked. 6 weeks, sir, Daniel answered. Mr. Haruna leaned back slowly. "Why did you not report it earlier?" Daniel answered honestly. "Because I was not certain enough of myself and I did not want to be wrong and cause confusion. I waited until I had enough evidence that what I was seeing was real." Mr. Haruna said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. 2 days later, Richard arrived on site. He called Daniel into a private meeting room inside the site office. He sat across from him the same way he had sat across from him in that small compound in Kano village. The same calm eyes. The same steady presence. "Daniel," he said, "Mr. Haruna has told me everything." Daniel waited quietly. Richard continued. "You saved this project. More than that, you showed the kind of judgment and integrity that most experienced men in this industry never develop." He placed both hands on the table. "I am removing you from the training program," Richard said. Daniel's face remained still, but something tightened in his chest. Then Richard continued. "Because I am giving you full supervisory responsibility over this project effective immediately. You will be paid accordingly. And when this project is completed, I want you in my head office." Daniel looked at him without speaking for several seconds. Then Richard added one more thing. "I called my mother this morning," he said. "She cried when I told her." Something broke open quietly inside Daniel at those words. He thought of Margaret sitting on her old wooden bench. He thought of the morning he had carried her clay pot down a dusty road without knowing where it would lead. He thought of his own mother and how she never got to see any of this. He lowered his head for just a moment. Then he looked back up at Richard with steady eyes. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I will not waste this." Richard stood and extended his hand. "I know you will not," he said. They shook hands firmly. Outside the site office, the city of Lagos continued moving loudly in every direction. Workers carried steel and mixed concrete under the afternoon sun. Cranes moved slowly against the sky. And somewhere far away in a small village compound in Kano, an old woman named Margaret sat on her wooden bench with her eyes closed and her hands resting in her lap. As if she already knew. As if she had always known. That the young man who once carried her clay pot down a dusty road without asking for anything in return was never going to stay poor for long. Because that is how life works. Not always quickly. Not always easily. But always honestly.